Valley Forge, say a little bit about Valley Forge this morning. It's just outside of Philadelphia. And this little article kind of explains it's really an amazing thing that is directly connected to our winning our independence as a country. It's a place that in the minds of most Americans who know what it is. We're talking about courage today in Bible classes and stuff, and Valley Forge is really one of those things that is linked in the minds of most Americans with things like courage, loyalty, perseverance, things like that. 9,000 of George Washington's troops came there in late 1777. 4 months earlier, 9,000 came. 4 months later, 6,000 were still alive. During the Revolutionary War, the British Army marched into Philadelphia and made themselves at home for the winter. George Washington could do nothing to stop them. Once the British were in the city, the only thing he could do was to see that they didn't get into the countryside to do any mischief. So he chose for his winter quarters Valley Forge, a place outside and up above Philadelphia. And you can still go there today. And it's up high, and you can kind of see how they could have been there to try to keep an eye on things. The American Army could defend itself there if attacked, and it could keep a close watch on the British. It would have been easier to fight many battles than to spend the winter in Valley Forge. It was December, and there was no shelter of any kind. The Army began constructing huts for themselves. They built some of heavy logs with roofs made of small trees and straw. Clay was spread on top of that. The windows were just holes cut through the logs and covered with oil paper. They constructed themselves some cabins not anywhere nearly as good as the cabins here. Most of the huts were made of piled up sod or fence rails held together by twigs and daubed with clay. The snow that winter sifted in every opening. The rain dripped through even the best of the roofs, and the wind howled and roared and blew in every crevice. There were few blankets, and many brave defenders of their country lay on the frozen ground because they didn't even have straw to put under their heads. Sometimes they sat up all night, crowding up to the fires to keep from freezing. Their clothes were worse than the shelter. The whole army was in rags. Many men had no shirts. And this is our army. Even more had no shoes. Can you imagine being barefoot in those kind of conditions? No heat, all winter, trying to fight a war. Wherever they walked, it is said the snow was marked with blood. Some cut strips from their blanket and wound them around their feet to protect them from the freezing ground. Food was scarce. Sometimes for several days the soldiers went without meat, and some even without bread. When the word went around, "No meat tonight," the soldiers groaned. But talk about perseverance, they never quit. Here's one entry from a diary of one of the men who was there. There comes a soldier. His bare feet peep through his worn-out shoes, his legs nearly naked from the tattered remains of an only pair of stockings, his shirt hanging in strings, his face meager. His whole appearance pictures a person forsaken and discouraged. He comes and cries with an air of wretchedness and despair. "I am sick, my feet lame, my legs are sore, my body's covered with this tormenting itch. My clothes are worn out, my constitution is broken, my former activity is exhausted by fatigue. Hunger and cold, I fail fast, I shall soon be no more." Well, in the midst of all of this, one day a Quaker farmer was walking along a creek near there, and he heard a voice in the woods. So going closer, he discovered a horse tied to a sapling, but there wasn't any rider there. Going nearer still, he looked through a thicket and saw a man on his knees in the snow, and it was General George Washington. His cheeks were wet with tears as he prayed to God for help and guidance. And so the man stood there and listened to George Washington pray for a few minutes. And the farmer quietly slipped away. When he reached home, he said to his wife, "The Americans will win their independence. George Washington will succeed." And his wife asked him, Isaac, what makes you think so? He said, I have heard George Washington pray, Hannah, out in the woods today. If there is anyone on this earth the Lord will listen to, it is this brave commander. He will listen, Hannah. Rest assured, he will. And of course, we did win our independence because of the bravery of those people at Valley Forge and because of the bravery of a lot of other people. Some of you have probably heard this quote, but I think it's a good one to give. And it's really important, I think, for all of us to remember something about America. Our founders were very clear, and in fact, in a lot of their writings, you can see it. They were very clear that this country would only ultimately stay free if it was a moral country. And there was a man who was a Frenchman named Alex de Tocqueville, and this quote is attributed to him. He says, he came over to America just to see. America was a young country, and they were accomplishing a lot, and he came over to see what was the secret of America. And he said this quote is attributed to him. I sought for the greatness and the genius of America in her commodious harbors and her rivers. It wasn't there. In the fertile fields and the boundless prairies, and it wasn't there. In her rich mines and her vast world commerce, and it was not there. It was not until I went into the churches of America and heard her pulpits aflame with righteousness did I understand the secret of her genius and power. And then he said this, America is great because she's good. And if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. And I believe that, and I think that's true. We take a lot for granted in this country, and one of the things that we take for granted is that our country will always be what it's always been. But history shows that's not true. I used to teach social studies and history in high school, and I used to tell my students, one of these days, 100 years from now, there may be students like you sitting in a classroom somewhere in another country, and the teacher will say, back when the United States was in existence, and the students will say, what? What's the United States? Now see, we can't imagine that today. We can't imagine that students might sit in a classroom and say, what's the United States? What was that? But it could happen someday. And if you don't believe it, then tell me how many of the emperors of Rome can you name? How many of the kings of Assyria or Egypt can you name? Those were the world powers of their day, and we barely know that they exist. So it's important for us to remember those things, I think, as citizens of this great country. The scripture that I want you to be thinking about today is Isaiah 12:2. We're talking about courage. In Isaiah 12:2 it says, I will trust and not be afraid, for the Lord Jehovah is my strength. I will trust and not be afraid, for the Lord Jehovah is my strength. Isaiah 12:2. It's a great scripture.